Having these jobs within like 6 to 8 months for this long-term distance survey. You wouldn't mind right hand seeing your yes. Oh, so so on your survey is a hushy. Yes. You're assuming I know what you mean by Juniper management. I don't know what you mean by Juniper management. Thank you for pointing that out. So for example, thinning, active management. So any type of management of Juniper that's not just stand back, leave them. Have you been out seeing? Yep. Herbicide use. It's all the above.
So the recording.
Yes. Okay.
So cool. Thank you everyone for joining. If you don't know, my name is Mara. I am the president of the Native Plant Society High Desert chapter here in Bend, Oregon. I have some housekeeping things to inform you guys before Jenna gets started. So tomorrow we have a ancient juniper trail hike that's out by like Brothers over in the Badlands Wilderness area. A ton of people are going to be there. There's BLM that's going to be out there, Onda that's going to be out there. The Old Growth Forest Network is going to be out there. I'm going to be out there representing us. And apparently the TV newscasters are going to be out there. So it's going to be a fun event if you want to come and hang out and celebrate Old Growth Forest. That's happening tomorrow at 4:30 p.m.
Where? Because you said Badlands Brothers, and those are two different places.
Yeah, so it's going to be in the trail, the Ancient Juniper Trail. That start of it is it's right next to this other trail that's really popular. Which one? Flat Iron. Yes, Flat Iron. So they're the same trail.
Brothers. That's right outside of Bend.
Right. Yes. Yes, it is the Badlands. So the Badlands Wilderness area. And so yeah, everyone's going to be out there just celebrating Old Growth Forest. So if you want to come, go ahead and come. And then on the 26th, so Sunday, we are having a BioBlitz. If you're not familiar to what a BioBlitz is, iNaturalists every year has this like city nature challenge, and every city participates in doing a BioBlitz. And what does that mean? It just means going around, taking pictures of anything that's living, essentially. So plants, bugs, all that sorts, birds even. So we're having a BioBlitz at Tethro Crossing Park in Redmond at 9 a.m. And so if you guys want to come and BioBlitz with us, that will be. And then next Saturday is a hike that's going to be led by Ben, our vice president. He is leading a hike out in Chimney Rock, out by Prineville. And that one's going to start at 9 a.m. So if you want to go out with Ben, he's super knowledgeable about native plants, and he's very enthusiastic about native plants. So if you want to go out there and look at native plants with him, that will be at Chimney Rock Trailhead. Cool. Okay. Those are basically all of my announcements. Yeah, I think let's give a warm welcome to Jenna. She's going to talk about junipers.
So thank you, Mara. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here. My name is Jenna Deibel, and I am the full title is Central Oregon Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Agent / Assistant Professor of Practice serving Crook, Deschutes, Jefferson counties, and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. But my community title is Central Oregon Extension Forester, and essentially what I am is I am an informal educational resource on all things forestry and natural resources for the region. I'm a generalist by trade. I'm available for questions quite literally about anything that is under that umbrella of forestry and natural resources. I've had people bring rocks to the office they need identified, and I'm the closest extension person to that. That being said, over the last couple of years that I've been in this position, there has been one topic in particular that has encroached onto my programming as much as it's encroached onto our landscape. And that is juniper ecology and management. Turns out that there isn't really anyone else that's giving these sorts of talks and unbiased scientific information about juniper. And so I'm happy to fill that niche. And so with that being said, what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to go over some basics of ecology and biology, the factors that have led to juniper expansion across our landscape, learn some tips and tricks about old growth ID that might help you guys out tomorrow. And then we'll go into some management considerations. We'll explicitly talk about the juniper and water relationship, what we do know, what we don't know, a standard approach to juniper treatment and management. And then I'll also just do a brief overview of some common goals that I hear from folks with junipers on their property and how to, a basic way of approaching them. What this presentation will not be. This will not be a conversation of cut them all down, nor will it be a conversation of leave them all alone. I myself have a very complicated relationship with juniper. I like to liken it to a friend that you've had since you were a little kid, like 5 years old, and you grow up and you become adults and you become individuals. And sometimes that childhood friend does something that makes you go, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed to be associated with you right now. But I still love you at the end of the day. So that's my relationship with juniper. And I hope to inspire a similar sort of complicated relationship in you all here today. So, setting the scene here, Western juniper currently occupies over 6 million acres across the Eastern Oregon landscape. They can be found in most any sort of environment. They are found anywhere between 600 to 7,000 feet elevation, although mainly they're going to stick between that 3,000 to 5,000 foot range. They can be found in places with annual precipitation levels from anywhere from 7 inches per year to over 30 inches per year. But on average, you're going to find them in that 10 to 15 annual precip range. And you can also find them in most soil types. They're going to be in the sands, they're going to be in the loams, they're going to be in the clays. But in general, they're really into the dry and cold stuff. And so that adaptability of being able to establish in most any landscape out here in Eastern Oregon has paid off big time. And so depending on where you are in the Eastern Oregon landscape, there's anywhere between 5 to 10 times the amount of juniper biomass on the landscape as there was historically pre-Euro-American settlement. So just a really brief discussion on form and identifying juniper. I mean, how do you know what a juniper is? By the way that it is. But just some really quick fun facts about it that help distinguish it from other juniper trees that might overlap on some of those peripheries. So juniper trees, Western juniper trees, have both the female parts, the berry cones, and the male parts, which are these little brown florets that you can see at the ends of the leaflets. Now, normally when a tree has both parts on one tree, it's going to be called monoecious. And if it has parts on different trees, it's going to be dioecious. Juniper's got to be weird. So they are termed submonoecious. And this means that depending on what juniper you're looking at, the proportion of male to female cones can be wildly different. So you can see junipers that look virtually like they're all female. You can find junipers that look like they're virtual all male. Some that are perfect 50-50 and everything in between. And so this is a big distinguishing feature between that and like Sierra juniper to the south, or Rocky Mountain juniper, which grows out in the Wallowas area. And then secondarily, the other big defining characteristic of Western juniper compared to other juniper trees that it overlaps with are these conspicuous white resin glands that are on the stomata of each leaflet. Rocky Mountain juniper, Sierra juniper, they don't have that going on for them. So just some the special things about juniper form there. So let's talk about what are some of the ecological, biological characteristics that have led to these trees being so dang hardy. So historically, pre-Euro-American settlement, they were found on rim rock and rock outcrops like this guy over in the Lost Forest down kind of towards Lakeview area, and also in places with low productivity soils, so out east of Bend. Essentially all the places where fire couldn't reach them is where they historically would grow. Seed is spread by gravity, water runoff, but most juniper seeds are actually spread by animals and primarily from birds. So when juniper seeds just drop down to the ground, it'll take anywhere between like 2 to 3 years for that outer casing to decompose and get that berry ready for germination. But a bird eats a seed goes through the digestive tract, gets pooped out, it's ready for germination immediately. And so what this leads to in terms of interrelationships between juniper establishment and poop and shrubs is that they most commonly establish under shrub cover. On average, it's like 2/3, but it can be like over 75% of junipers in some areas are growing in shrub bushes. And so they sort of have a parasitic relationship with shrubs. So they utilize the shrubs to protect themselves from exposure, from grazing pressure, and also they're able, within these shrubs, yes, they're protected from exposure. They're also creating these really nice establishment microclimates, and the shrubs are bringing in nutrients that the juniper is able to exploit and utilize for itself. And over time, the juniper will grow out of the bush, push it out, kill it, and a juniper tree stands there instead of a shrub. And so this is very specific to Western juniper also. Not all junipers are doing this. This is very special to our Western juniper. They also have a super well-developed root system. This is a photo that a friend of mine took up in Warm Springs. She had been out on maternity leave for several months and came back to a monitoring plot of hers, and she was like, that rockfall wasn't there before. And so taking a closer look at it, you can just see how incredible the root system is here. And primarily, they have mainly lateral roots. They will grow tap roots when they are young, but mostly unless they're in deep soils, their taproot is likely going to burn off. And it's mainly going to be those lateral roots that can extend usually like 1.5 times the crown width, but they can be out as far as 3 times the crown width away from the tree. And of course, they're also slow growing and long lived. Our oldest juniper that we know of is Western juniper specifically is over 1,600 years old and is out on Horse Ridge in Bend, or outside of Bend. And I'll have a photo of that one here in a little bit. So let's talk about juniper expansion in Eastern Oregon. So looking at some photos, and something before I get into these photos is all the photos that we're going to be seeing here are in the John Day soil formation, not the soil formation here. So this is not necessarily what juniper infill looked like here. So just want to put that context in here first, but these photos are really dramatic and show the expansion. And so I like having them in here. But here we can see in the John Day River Valley, how juniper just exploded over the course of a few decades. This is a really classic photo of Keystone Ranch out east of Prineville of juniper expansion. And this is from 1989. Looking at a Google Maps image from 2021, this has only just gotten thicker and bigger. But they did like a thinning operation over here. So you can see like some evidence of that, which is pretty interesting. And then, anyone here know what iconic Central Oregon landmark this is?
Is it Black Butte?
No.
Glass View?
No. It is Grizzly Mountain.
Oh.
Yeah. So back in the day, that entire south face was just grass. This is from back in 1910, I believe this photo was taken. And you can see evidence in the way back that on the north side of Grizzly Mountain, there is an existing ponderosa Doug fir forest population. And that still existed on the north side back in the day, but the south side was grassland. There were hardly any junipers over there. And then this is just a really cool photo that the collections manager over at the Bowman took for a flyer for a talk I gave them a couple of weeks ago. This is of the old Prineville grade. And so photo from 1900, and you can see Barnes Butte here in the continuation of the landscape and just how much juniper has exploded over in the Prineville area. So briefly, just breezing over the different stages of juniper woodland succession, this is really important to know for determining what management actions are most appropriate, given your goals and of course, which woodland succession you're at. So at phase 1, you've got some trees that are present, but your shrub and herb layer is going to be the dominant vegetation layer that's determining ecological site function. Once we move into phase 2, that's when trees are co-dominant with the shrubs and herbs. And then phase 3, trees are dominant vegetation. reproduction. So you'll notice that these two phase 3 photos look very different from one another. And that's because these are very different soil profiles. And so phase 3 will look different depending on if you have a shallow soil profile or if you have a deep soil profile. And so over here, if you have more than 40% canopy cover, you're going to start getting these dead limbs and the understory happening here. But both of these are phase 3 juniper. So phase 3 juniper looks so different depending on which kind of soil profile you're looking at. What's a good way to just kind of easily be like, oh, I'm in phase 3 versus I'm in phase 2? No berries in the phase 3. They are not reproducing because there's no room for reproduction. So over here, this is where you're going to be seeing your maximum berry production. This is where you're going to have your female full trees where you're just like, they're basically blue. And by the time you hit that phase 3, your reproductive structures are going to be pretty dominantly absent. So what are the reasons why juniper expanded across our landscape? As with all things in natural resources, it's never just one thing. Nature's too complicated for that. And the same is true for juniper expansion. And I like to liken it to a 1, 2, 3 punch. So first, starting off in the mid-late 1800s, we had a period of milder temperatures and higher precipitation. And so we just didn't have as wild swings of our temperatures as we're used to having in Central Oregon, plus more rain. And essentially what that did was it primed the landscape for juniper establishment across Eastern Oregon. So there is some evidence of some juniper expansion before white people got here, but it is not nearly to the same level as what we saw immediately after white folks got here, and we made 2 critical land management decisions. First off being, we grazed this land hard. We did season-long grazing with hundreds of head of cattle and sheep, and what this did was it decimated the herbaceous population. Now, if you're looking at a landscape like this, not a juniper tree to be seen, the herbaceous population is decimated, what we would have seen first was shrub expansion across our landscape. And my hot take is that we have just as much of a shrub expansion issue as we do a juniper expansion issue in our landscape. But what this did was, what we learned in one of these previous slides, junipers like to establish in shrub cover. And back in the day, there were no homes, there were no power lines. So where were all the birds sitting? They were sitting in shrubs. And so by doing this hardcore livestock grazing, reducing the herbaceous population, we increased the amount of germination sites in a landscape that was already primed for establishing and germinating junipers. At the same time, we removed fire from the landscape. Historically, lightning strikes would have had fires going across these grasslands every 2 to 25 years here in Central Oregon. And it takes about the absence of fire for about 70 years for junipers to start encroaching onto a grassland landscape, and we remove fire for far longer than that period of time. And so those fires that would have originally pulled those young junipers before they had a chance to establish into phases of succession weren't able to occur. And so again, not just one thing, it's a combination of a primed landscape from a climatic period that we had. We grazed the land hard and we removed fire from the landscape. And all of those things together led to the expansion of juniper across our landscape. So let's talk about old growth identification. How do we figure out which of these trees that have expanded are old and which ones are young? And this is especially important for folks out here where we have less of the just massive explosion of juniper, but we have more infill of young junipers among all of our old growth. So knowing how to identify old growth, really good skill. So first, really quickly, want to go over the historic distribution of old growth juniper. Like I mentioned, specifically about those photos that we saw, those were in the John Day soil formation. So not all old growth juniper grows the same. And it can be split up generally based on ecoregions in Oregon. And we're here at the Red Star. So starting off in our sedimentary soils up in the John Day and heading into the Columbia Basin, this is where we have the least available information. But Primarily, old growth junipers would have been in shallow, rocky soils, rocky outcrops. They would have been what we call topographically confined, so in places where fire could not reach them. There is, however, some historic evidence of some stand replacing fire of old growth juniper woodlands in this area, but it's not across the entire landscape. So there were likely pockets of groves and woodlands across the John Day soil formation, but primarily it would have been these guys that were topographically confined on a rocky outcrop. And less than 5% of the junipers that you find out here are going to be considered old growth. Now moving down into our igneous soils, down into the sagebrush steppe, these guys also would have been primarily topographically confined, but there is some evidence of more evidence of woodland in this area as opposed to the John Day soil formation, but primarily we're going to see like only 5% canopy cover up here. It's going to be relatively not dense. And again, you're going to find them on the shallow rocky soils. They're also down here specifically found in heavy clay soils as well. And then less than 10% of the junipers here are going to be considered old growth. So less than 5%, less than 10. And then we move into the Mazama complex. So these are pumice soils or sands. This is where old growth savanna was, out east of Bend and in the Redmond Sisters Bend Triangle. And over 10% of the junipers that we have out here are considered old growth, depending on where you're standing. To make it more complicated, but I think it's really important. I like to split the Mazama complex in half and split it up as the east of Bend is our old growth. The Redmond Sisters Bend Triangle is what I call new old growth. Because, for an old growth ponderosa, it's going to be something that's like 250, 550 years old. Old growth juniper is like 250 to 1600 years old, right? So there's a big range in what old growth juniper can be. And so because as you move north in the Mazama complex, the soils start, and you're transitioning into the John Day soil formation, soils start to get a little bit more productive. And so you get a little bit more fine fuel production. And so whereas out here east of Bend, you've got groves of 1,000+ year old trees because the soils are so non-productive, there's just nothing that could carry fire to those trees so they're able to withstand for over 1,000 years. Now in the Bend Redmond Sisters Triangle, and this is where I live, so I live among old growth junipers, but they're sub 1,000 years old. And if you hike out west of Klein Buttes, down the Cascade View Trail, down the Blue Belly Stem, you'll see it's a really interesting spot to walk through because you'll walk through an area that's historically old growth savanna, and it's got some pretty accurate spacing to how it would be. And I'd say these trees are approximately like 700-ish years old. And then you walk into an open area where there's a lot more younger trees, but there's evidence of stand replacing fire that's like centuries old through there too. Keep on walking, go back into another grove of a different age class, but still old growth. And so in that triangle, what we would have seen are mixed severity and stand replacing fire and a matrix of that across the landscape. And so the trees out there are anywhere, but I say between like 300 to 800 years old. But again, on rocky outcroppings, I've seen some trees that are probably over 1,000 years old up there too. Very briefly, going over our different age classes of junipers. So our juvenile junipers, so these are the guys that are going to be establishing in our shrub cover. They keep their stomata open, and they do this, one, to maximize carbon intake, because this is when they're producing a taproot, right? But at the same time, be very careful, they're also protecting themselves from grazing pressure and also from human yoinking pressure. They hurt. They're very spiky. And so just to say, just like a little word from the wise of if, you're trying to be like really good about handling young junipers before they have a chance to really establish and you're just walking around your property, you see a little guy, you're like, oh, let's pull that guy out of the ground. One, its root is not going to let you do that. And two, it's going to hurt like so just wanted to point that out to you all. And then the difference between post-settlement and old growth trees, and this is that 1600-year-old juniper that's out east of Bend. And to put it simply, post-settlement trees look like this. Old growth trees look like this. And it is pretty much that simple. So typically for old growth trees, when we're aging them and determining whether they're old growth, we'll take what's called an increment borer and we'll core into the tree and we'll pull out this core and we'll count the rings. Now, old growth junipers are so gnarly and rotten. They got rotted insides. They're all warped all over the place that there has been many a forester who's lost an increment borer to a juniper tree. So the scientists who are actually aging old growth trees, they'll do it by either carbon dating or, like in the case of our oldest juniper here, they'll do what's called a punch cut. So they'll take a chainsaw, you got your tree right here, and they'll go zing, 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 and they'll pull out a big block of juniper and count the rings that way. And as long as you don't subject the juniper to several of those, they're going to be totally fine. But if you are just a property owner and you want to figure out like which of my trees are old growth and like approximately how old are they, you're not going to want to do punch cuts on every single one of your junipers. And I also don't want to do punch cuts on every single juniper that I see trying to age it. And so most commonly, and this is no joke, we most commonly identify old growth based on how weird it looks. And what that means in scientific terms is we're looking at old growth characteristics, and we'll go over what those specific old growth characteristics here are in a second. But first, careful, looks can be deceiving. So these are two old growth junipers in Idaho. They're in approximately the same location, approximately same elevation. This guy over here is about 6 feet tall, 8 inches diameter. This guy here is like 40 foot tall, 36-inch diameter. This guy right here is about 300, 350 years old. This guy's over 600 years old. So my question for you all is, what gives? Why is this guy so much bigger but younger than this guy? But they're in the similar location, they're the same elevation. What's different?
Water source.
Yeah, this guy's trying to grow on a rock. It's really tough to grow on a rock. You end up looking kind of stunted and small like this guy. And so for this exact reason, a size class, it does in diameter, does not determine old growth for juniper specifically, because, in my area up in the Redmond Sisters area where I live among old growth trees, often to me, it seems like the youngest ones among them are actually the tallest among them. And those old growth trees, some of them can be tall, but mostly they're kind of short and stubby. And so size does not matter for old growth juniper. It's really going to be, again, those old growth characteristics. And what are those characteristics? First, canopy form. This is essentially the weirdness factor. So these are your asymmetric rounded tops. You've got spreading and sparse canopies. You might have dead limbs or spiked tops in here. And this asymmetry and weirdness can occur for reasons, but to go over the primary way, the primary means by which we think juniper trees go from this to this is a process by which we call cavitation. And essentially it's the production of an embolism in the water column of the juniper trees that anything above that air bubble and embolism dies. How this happens, because this is actually cavitation can occur in a lot of different trees, but the fact that it occurs so much in our Western juniper is very specific to our climatic conditions here. And we are actually just coming out of the perfect cavitation weather period. It's that late winter, early spring series of weather whiplashes we get. We get that random 75-degree day in March, and then 2 days later it's snowing. So what happens when that occurs is our juniper trees are transpiring all year round, especially our guys at lower elevation around here. And so you hit that 70-degree day in March, your juniper tree is going to be like, oh my God, this is amazing. I'm photosynthesizing all over the place, evapotranspirating, this is amazing, but I need to make up for all these resources that I'm losing from my roots. I go to try to suck up more water. Oh no, soil's still frozen. So what this does is I liken it to trying to suck on a straw with one end covered. And you're creating so much negative pressure that eventually those columns collapse on themselves. Now, when juniper trees, any other tree, that's enough to cavitate it. Juniper's got to be hardy and weird, so that's not what does it. After that period of drought-induced cavitation, we inevitably get that period of freezing. When that freezing period happens, that existing air bubble expands because it's taking in the air from the water that's freezing around it, expands, fully cavitates the water column, and then everything above the ebullition dies. And so what that leads to, and you can kind of see the transition here. So this is a guy that cavitated that year, the year prior, because it's still got his foliage, dead foliage still on there. This guy probably cavitated in the last 2 or 3 years. And this guy, you can start to see those lateral branches are becoming the new leaders. And we're starting to see some rounding of the crown there. And then just to show some more examples of this, of cavitation and how that results in, again, these weird rounded crowns. They can be pretty absurd looking. And I mean, granted I'm a juniper nerd, but I have a really fun time looking at old growth trees and trying to find the like little spiked top somewhere in it, because often you'll find it in there. And trees can cavitate multiple times in a lifetime, and they likely will. Yes?
So I'm kind of a juniper nerd too.
Yeah.
But how long does it take from getting a spike like that
Mhm.
to when it starts looking like a snag with the covered lichen all over it?
Ooh, how long does
I
it take the
think
lichen to
trees-
get on
I
there?
spend thousands of hours in the Badlands, literally, to
Mhm.
live there, and they're every single day.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just wondering, they often are half alive and
Mhm.
half ghost tree
Mhm.
or snag.
Mm-hmm.
And how long does it take till it covers up like that? And it looks like a whole different entity.
Like, and you're specifically talking about the wolf lichen colonization?
Yeah. Because I see them most consistently when they're spiky like that.
Yeah.
Time to get wolf lichen on them.
Exactly. So I'm trying to think. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I'm trying to think through observationally because and this is actually our next old growth characteristic here is the presence of wolf lichen. So here, great transition. Thank you. And but like even though it's an old growth characteristic, just because wolf lichen's growing on it doesn't necessarily mean it's old growth, right?
Okay.
And so like I'll see little bits of wolf lichen growing on even young trees if they just happen to be in a similar area to where there's already a wolf lichen population going on. And so I don't think it takes that long for it to start establishing. How long it takes to completely cover a tree, that I don't really know, but I can look into that and get back to you.
Though, because you've seen it on young trees too, so it's just a matter of what's around it.
Whatever's close. Yeah, precisely.
Interesting.
So we've got 2 distinct types of wolf lichen on our trees, even though they all look the same, and they often grow together. So we have Lotharia columbiana. This is that guy right here. He has more of a thicker structure, and they have these large black basal cups on them, as opposed to our Lotharia vulpina. This is going to have more of a wispy texture to it, kind of look a little more like an old man's beard in a way. And then when they grow, they often grow with each other on trees. And so here's the 2 kinds starting to grow on a little branch right here. And you can kind of see that there is like a very, very slight color difference between them. They're like virtually the same, but I feel like whenever I see these guys, they're like a little bit yellower than these guys. But that's just kind of my take. Now, this isn't confirmed, but I'm like almost positive that these guys are hybridizing all over the place, which makes sense because they're growing on the same trees all over the place. So I see these guys a lot where they've got a very similar structure to the vulpina, but they've got the basal cups on them like the columbiana does. So I haven't gotten them genetically tested, but my hypothesis is that there are hybrids of the wolf lichen going on here. And then, so you can have trees, juniper trees, that have weird abnormal crowns and they'll have wolf lichen on them, but they're not necessarily old growth trees. And so if you're looking at a tree and you're like, I can't tell if this is old growth or not, I'm seeing some characteristics, but not others, this is what's going to give it away, the bark texture. So these are 3 trees out west of Klein Buttes. They are all right next to each other, all virtually the same height, virtually the same shape. They're all at least 100-year age difference from one another. And I know that looking at the bark texture. So first, looking at this guy on the right, He's got really gray bark. And if I were to place my hand on this trunk, it would feel virtually flat on my hand, right? Now, move to this guy over here. Our bark color is going to start getting a little more red, a little more cinnamon colored, and our bark is going to start to get a little more furrowed. So if I were to put my hand on here, I'd start to feel some ridges and bumps under my hand. And then finally, we've got our guy in the back here who's even redder, got even more furrowed bark, and oh my God, this guy's got some wolf lichen on him too. Oh, he must be an old growth. And so this is generally deeper furrows, redder bark is going to be old growth juniper. Now, when our trees cavitate, they are essentially killing a section of their cambium layer. And so over time, whatever killed cambium layer cavitated is going to turn gray because it's dead. And so for our really, really, really old growth junipers, where like they have a single living branch over here or something like that, they might look super gray because virtually all their cambium is dead. So old growth, generally, yes, we're going to have redder bark, but that's to a point if they get beat up enough and cavitated enough. So, but if you're just walking around and like, essentially, if it gets to that point, you're going to look at a juniper tree and you're like, oh, I obviously know that's old growth. But if you're kind of trying to figure out whether something is old growth or not, you're kind of confused, or you're trying to determine, like for me, it helps me determine, you know, whether this is like a 300-year-old tree versus an 800-year-old tree versus an over 1,000-year-old tree. I'm still trying to learn how to distinguish between the different like post-settlement tree ages because they can be such wildly different shapes and sizes. So really briefly, just want to go over some other mechanisms of juniper form that don't necessarily mean that they're old growth, but make people go like, whoa, they look really weird like this. What's going on here? So first, we got midges, mistletoes, and phytoplasma. Oh my. So this is just going to be a brief conversation on some of these very obvious foliar things that are going on with junipers that, you know, I get questions about them. So first things, we've got these gall midges, juniper gall midges. And essentially, these are flies that lay their eggs on the leaflets. The laying of the eggs inspires this chemical reaction that results in a structure that forms around the larva. It looks kind of like a hops cone, artichoke head. People often confuse them with a reproductive structure on the juniper tree, but they're its own separate thing. When they're green like this, the larva is still inside. If you were to cut it open, you'd see a little dude crawling in there. Once they're brown and hard like this, larva has already exited. It's a fly. It's gone. So our mistletoe, so some folks in here might have heard of dwarf mistletoe before. It's what causes the big, we call it witch's brooming, but big copious growth, like bulbous growth on like ponderosa trees or Doug fir or hemlock trees. If you drive up the 20 up past Subtle Lake and you look out to the south, you'll see just these trees that look almost dead, but there are these like big bulbs of growth across them. That's from something called dwarf mistletoe, and that is harmful to trees because it injects itself into the phloem where the nutrient transport system is, and it acts as a parasite and utilizes those nutrient resources that the tree would otherwise use because the fruiting body of dwarf mistletoes can't photosynthesize themselves. In contrast, juniper has leafy mistletoes. So this is a true mistletoe, and it has a fruiting body that can photosynthesize itself, and it injects itself into the xylem of the tree. So it's taking water resources from them, but not nutrient resources from them. And the cool thing about them is they've got these really fun pink berries. Sorry, this guy's a couple weeks old, but you still got the pink berries on there, that coral structure. When they're fresh, they'll have a green color, but as they age and die, they'll start to take on this golden hue. And so if you ever see like golden orbs within juniper trees, that's what's going on there. Now, kind of fun about them, they make for a really nice Christmas decoration. There are native leafy mistletoe, and I put these up around the office this year, and they were a big hit. So I think they're really cute. They got the nice pink berries, would highly recommend. And then phytoplasma. So this is most typically what mistletoeing looks like, is these big bulbous growths on trees. So back in like 2010 or so, they were one of my colleagues, Amy Jo Detweiler, horticulturist, if anyone here knows her, yeah. She was getting calls about these growths on junipers, and folks were explaining them as mistletoe or as a gymnosperrangium fungal rust. But she was looking at these growths and she wasn't seeing any fruiting bodies on them. No mistletoe fruiting bodies, no fungal fruiting bodies. And so she was convinced. She said, this is something different. This is something unique. And so she was a squeaky wheel and got this stuff genetically tested. Turns out it's a whole unique thing on its own, and it's called a phytoplasma. And instead of being caused by a fungus like a mistletoe is, it's caused by a bacteria that's commonly spread through insects, typically leaf hoppers, and that reaction with the bacteria inspires this copious amounts of growth. But again, it's not the fruiting body is able to photosynthesize itself, and so it's not really doing any harm to the tree by being there. I do see in places where we have that phase 3 encroachment and we're starting to see trees outcompete with one another. The trees with mistletoe and phytoplasma I see go out first before the ones that don't, but otherwise I don't really see too much impact there. And just to quickly point out what phytoplasma does not look like. So if you see one of these big bulbs and you look up close into it and you see these little brown dots towards the base of the stomates here, that's a rust. That's a gymnosperrangium rust. If you don't see those growths, it's a phytoplasm. And then final little doohickey here is juniper pocket rot. This is what makes our juniper trees hollow. It's a type of white fungal heartwood rot, and so it only eats the dead parts of the tree. And so it essentially creates these hollow structures. This is a tree on my driveway home, and I can never get a picture that like really shows how wild this tree is. It's a crescent. It's quite literally a crescent down here. And the rest of the tree looks totally fine and full and flush, but like it's a crescent and you can see right through it. I have no idea how this tree is still alive and standing. It's crazy. So pocket rot can be pretty pervasive and not necessarily kill trees, but it does make them a little more structurally weak and more prone to falling over, that sort of thing. But really, and not all old growth trees necessarily have pocket rot, because I'm seeing young trees with these fungal spores on them. They're not necessarily getting the hollowed out nature yet. But more often than not, if you're seeing like extensive pocket rot, it's going to be something that's over 200 years old and is likely going to be old growth. And then this is a juniper tree at my house. Nice, big, beautiful, at least 300 years old, very full crown. We take a step closer to him. We go, oh wow, there's a nice little hole in there. And then we take a step closer and oh my God, you can look right through that guy. So just a little quick example of how this pocket rot can be really pervasive, but not necessarily harmful to the trees. So let's breeze through some management considerations. Why would we cut some juniper? I like to say that juniper management is not juniper eradication. Junipers are native here. They're not invasive. They are encroaching is the correct terminology for it. But there's many a reason why you might cut some juniper on your property. You might want to increase native grass or even first foods habitat. Increasing forage quality, hazardous fuels reduction, improving wildlife habitat, mitigating soil erosion. Maybe you want to get your hands in the juniper products market. And there's also equally the same number of reasons to not cut juniper, right? There are folks who it might be the only shade tree they have. They are more water efficient than our ornamental trees might be. And sometimes it can be the only thing you can grow out there. You might want privacy from your neighbors. And so I like to say in my position as extension forester, I am not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to give you the tools that you need to empower yourself to make the decisions you already want to make.
Why
So-
is cutting juniper good for wildlife habitat? That one surprises me. The rest I get.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll go into more detail in it in here just a second, if that's okay.
Okay.
All right. So first and foremost, though, I want to address the juniper and water relationship. This is my most number heavy slide, but I promise this is all going to condense down to a single statement after this. So essentially, junipers intercept a lot of water. It's very variable depending on how light or strong the storm is, but on average, it's intercepting approximately 50% of what's falling down. And so what this equates to is a 1-to-1 ratio of rainfall to interception rates. So as an example, if you were to have a juniper stand that had 50% canopy cover and you had 2 inches of rainfall, you would only have 1 inch of effective precipitation on your soil and on your herbaceous population. So they do intercept a lot of water. Also, they impact soil infiltration the more encroachment there is. When you increase the number of junipers, you are often decreasing the amount of herbaceous population, the amount of shrub population, and what the presence of especially those grasses do is they perform another form of interception. So if you have water that's running, it hits a bunch grass. And so for a second, as it's it has to divert itself around that bunch grass, it's slowing down for a second. And in that bit that it's slowing down, water is able to more easily infiltrate. You reduce those interception markers, water just goes straight down pretty much. And so it's approximately a 2 times difference depending on encroached juniper woodlands versus open rangeland in terms of infiltration rates. The presence of juniper also does impact soil water availability. So this is looking at the shallow soil profile, not the deep soil profile. Our junipers are transpiring year round. They can consume anywhere between 3 to 38 gallons of water a day. That 38 gallon number is only during a super rainy peak growing season time. So that's like a super rainy June for like 3 weeks is when we're going to be seeing that super high number. But on average, they're drinking about 13 gallons a day during peak growing season. And this is comparable. This is comparable to other trees, okay? But the problem is when we are shifting from a grassland ecosystem into a woodland ecosystem. Essentially, trees drink more water than grasses is kind of where it gets down to. It's a larger biomass. It needs more water than what the grasslands would have utilized historically. And you can think of trees as straws on a landscape, and any landscape is going to be like a cup of water, and it has a certain amount of given resources available. You put 1 straw in there, it takes out a certain amount of resources. You stick 10 straws in there, resources are going to get depleted a lot more quickly. Now we pair that with the fact that we don't necessarily have the same size cup that we did 30, 40 years ago. We have a little bit of a lower water availability out here these days. And so the juniper trees, especially with those lateral roots, are often in direct competition with our grasses, with our shrub layer population. Again, we're really only going to be seeing that taproot in those deep soil profiles, and that's where we see bunchgrass populations still being okay because they're not competing for water resources in the same water profile. And there has also been positive evidence that reducing juniper on the landscape does improve soil water availability for herbaceous populations, for shrub populations. Where we get a little more uncertain is when we talk about water yield. So there have been many a true story. Again, these are true stories of people that cut down junipers on their properties, and a spring comes up from whence there once was, and a stream that used to dry up every summer now flows year round. That absolutely happens. And we're doing some really cool research out in the Brothers area, the Camp Creek Paired Watershed Study. It's a 30-year study where we cut all the junipers from one watershed except for the old growth guys, and the next adjacent watershed left everything alone, and have been observing the hydrologic differences between those 2 watersheds over the last 30 years. And we've learned a lot from it. And it's pointing towards very positive results that doing juniper treatment can lead to higher water yields. Where this gets a little bit complicated is when we're talking about smaller parcel, the average landowner. So when we're talking about soil and water conservation districts or watershed councils or the Bureau of Land Management, when they're doing juniper treatments for hydrologic yield, they're doing 100+ acres of juniper treatment. The problem comes when we're talking about the average property owner that's like 20 acres or less, because we don't yet have the metrics by which I can tell you, hey, you look for this site condition. And if you cut junipers here, you will get a spring. You will raise your water table. We don't have those answers yet. And so more or less, if you're working in less than 20 acres, more or less a crapshoot at this point when it comes to improving your water yield. And so for that reason, right now, for small parcel landowners, we are not recommending removing juniper with improving water yield as your primary goal. Now, if you do juniper management for any of those other ecological reasons that we mentioned before, and you do it across your property, there's a chance that you're going to improve your water yield. You know, you might have spring that pops up from whence there once was. We just can't predict when that's going to happen. And so us as scientists and as land management advisors, we can't in good faith tell you, hey, if you do this, you're going to improve your water yield. I might come back to you guys in 5 years and be like, we know the answers. We know what to look for. Things in science change. But at this moment, when again, it comes to small parcel owners, soil and water conservation districts, the big orgs that are large landowners, whole different ballgame. But the average landowner, not recommending to manage for water yield specifically. And I'm going to skip over this and just kind of go breeze over really quickly some of our most common management goals that I hear about from landowners. First and foremost is hazardous fuels reduction in our juniper landscapes. If this is your primary goal, thinning and limbing is going to be the name of your game. Making sure that you're making efforts to reduce horizontal and vertical fuel continuity. Putting together great defensible spaces and strategic fuel breaks around critical infrastructure and high value infrastructure. What this can include, a high value structure is whatever you want it to be, right? And so, for instance, for those super old growth junipers where their branches hang down onto the ground, and if you were to limb up that tree, you might make it, unstable and fall over, and you'd also kind of ruin that old growth quality of the tree. But you also want to reduce hazardous fuels on your property. Just treat that old growth juniper like it's a piece of critical infrastructure and create defensible space around that old growth juniper that you want to keep. So, and then you're going to want to plan for maintenance. This is never just a one and done thing. I like to tell folks that in a disturbance driven landscape, if we are going to artificially remove that disturbance, say fire, and we want to maintain resiliency in our landscape, we are going to have to mimic that disturbance on a similar cyclic basis. And that's going to be that thinning and limbing on every 10 to 20 year cycle for hazardous fuels reduction to maintain that resiliency. Now let's talk about wildlife habitat. So our maximum wildlife habitat, or where we find the maximum wildlife diversity in juniper woodlands, are in open woodlands, so more widely spaced with a good diversity in vegetation structure. So a good mix of herbs, of shrubs, of juniper trees. When you reach that phase 3 juniper of just dense juniper that you've left alone, what did we learn was the main difference between phase 2 and phase 3?
And it won't reproduce.
And we're taking away the berries, right? Which is exactly what the wildlife, like birds, like to see. And so if you have an expanse of dense junipers, of phase 3 junipers in the middle of that, you're not going to have much going on for wildlife. There isn't food for them there. And same thing is true for even non-bird species that aren't necessarily eating the berries, but utilizing that habitat, like elk or mule deer. They like to have some pockets of denser junipers to have that thermal cover and protection and all of that. But again, if you have an expanse of that, of acres, those deer are not going in there. they're going to stick to that edge habitat because if they go into the middle there, they're far from their food, they're far from water resources, they're far from their reproductive sites. And this is true for a lot of wildlife that we have around here. They really like these, what we call edge habitats. And so places where you're seeing a transition from a tree, a primarily like treed area to a primarily meadowed area, or in the case of juniper woodlands, a really heterogeneous or really diverse structure across the landscape. And so having some pockets of dense cover, just similar to how you might have in a dry ponderosa ecosystem. You want to do your patchy, gappy, clumpy is what we call it when we're talking about improving or managing for wildlife habitat while doing active management on your property. And so not doing just equidistant rows and spacing between all of the trees and making it look like a garden, but making it look as complicated as nature is. And so by having a great expanse of phase 3 dense juniper woodlands, you're not incorporating that complicatedness that the wildlife really rely on. Does that answer your question?
It does. It just means that if you are doing your maintenance right, you get the wildlife.
Yes. Yep, precisely.
That's okay.
And we'll chat too about how these things can play in with each other in a second here.
Thank you.
So very much breezing over realistic rangeland restoration. You're going to take junipers down if you want to improve bunch grass populations or you want to restore grasslands. Now, if you have that phase 3 juniper woodland, and even if you have that phase 3 juniper woodland where you have an existing bunch grass population, if you go in and you just cut all those junipers down and you walk away and say, oh, well, I've got a good grass population, they're going to be fine. I like to liken it to taking someone who's lived in a closet for their entire life and shoving them out into the sunshine. Trees, plants, they're used to what they're used to, right? And so even if historically these bunch grasses would have been in open areas, if this particular plant grew its entire life in a shaded, protected environment overnight, you change that drastically, they're not going to respond well. And so if you just go in and cut all your dense phase 3 juniper trees, you're more than likely going to end up with a sea of cheatgrass the next year. And so if you do have a goal of rangeland restoration, you have that phase 3 juniper woodland, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's all for naught. I would just recommend taking a phased approach to your thinning. So taking 1 year, you go and you cut all the junipers that are like your height and flow, let the land rest for a year or two, come back in, cut down the junipers that are up to like 10 to 15 feet high, let the land rest for another year or two, rinse, repeat until you reach your desired ecological condition. So that's the recommendation that I'm giving there. And then the only other thing that I would add into this conversation is if you are felling junipers on a slope, and if you can, instead of felling it parallel to the slope, if you can fall it perpendicular to the slope, because that can help out with soil erosion and will also, as it's collecting soils, it's also creating these nice little microsites for bunch grasses and other native plants and also habitat that you might want to provide on your hillside landscape. So just want to throw that in there for consideration. Also, very briefly, it doesn't really apply to folks out here in the Mazama complex, but especially folks who are out in like Crook County or Warm Springs or Madras. These are historically where we would have had those topographically confined trees that were only 5 trees per acre. And so this is just a commentary of like 5 trees per acre for junipers doesn't look like this, just like a nice even spacing across the grassland. Can you tell this is rimrock and a rock outcropping? And so you might have like these slightly denser clusters of junipers and then wide spaces of nothing. And then maybe like a single juniper on a rock outcropping. So just a little commentary on just how heterogeneous and topographically ridden juniper form and structure is across a landscape. And then I'm going to skip over products, but there is a burgeoning juniper product market, and the same junipers that are encroaching, not the old growth junipers, make the best types of products. So with all of that being said, oh, actually, I do want to point out this guy. This is a guy in Sisters. He had never touched a chainsaw before in his life. He moves to this house. he's got 3 juniper trees that are both too close to his house for hazardous fuels purposes, and they're also blocking his view of the sisters. So he says, okay, well, I gotta go do something about this. And he goes out, he buys a chainsaw, he fells these 3 trees, and he says, well, what am I gonna do now? And thus started a 10+ year journey where this guy cut down almost every juniper on his property. He's got his own portable mill and all of this flooring, the stairs, the bench, that bed, the flower holder or the plant holder, all of that is juniper that he milled from his property. And he never touched a chainsaw before. He did have some flooring experience from back in his 20s. But otherwise, like, I don't know, I just love this as a testament of like, if he can do it, you can too. So to finish off, these goals that I briefly listed here, hazardous fuels reduction, wildlife habitat, native grass restoration products, these goals are not necessarily mutually exclusive from one another. Most commonly, I'll get folks who say, I want to reduce hazardous fuels in my property, but I also want to improve wildlife habitat. But when those two things are done thoughtfully and with creativity, they can be actually quite complementary to one another. Our wildlife out here is adapted to a disturbance-driven ecosystem. And so the similar things that would make that forest resilient to fire like it would have been historically are also the same things that can improve wildlife habitat. You can choose on your juniper woodlands. Maybe you have a pocket that you want to test out native grass restoration. You want to cut down all your junipers and maybe test out some rejuvera and planting and see what happens. And maybe again, those same junipers that you're taking out for hazardous fuels reduction are the same ones that are best for products. And maybe you know a guy who has a portable mill who you can sell some logs to on Facebook. And again, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive so long as you're mindful and creative about it. The thing that I love about juniper management is, for other kinds of silviculture, we have models and site indices, and we are very prescriptive about how we do management in our typical forest ecosystems. Now, because juniper historically has not been commercially viable, we don't have those things for juniper. And so that allows us to really, really lean into this creative aspect of juniper management. Again, there's a million reasons why you might cut juniper. There's a million reasons why you might not. And how you're going to cut it across your landscape is going to be wildly different depending on whether which soil formation you happen to be in, or what your topographic features happen to be in your landscape. And so just taking your time, nothing has to be immediate with these things, and making sure that you really think through your vision of how you want your landscape to look like before you embark on it. And then really, again, embracing this mindfulness, thoughtfulness, and creativity as you go through it. And so with that, got useful resources here, but I'm just going to put this out here, coming soon. So part of the reason why I'm doing all these talks right now is because right now there isn't really a resource on juniper that's not wildly biased one way or the other, or it's locked away in 90+ pages of numbers and diagrams that even I have to read over paragraphs multiple times to get the gist of. And so what I have a first written draft of, and I'm in the formatting, editing piece of it now, is I'm putting together a people's guide to Western juniper. And the idea of this is it's going to be 15 to 20 pages of basically everything we went over today for anyone, from practitioners to students to just the landowner who has no natural resource background, but I moved to a property with juniper. What do I need to know to just live among these trees and understand them? And that's what the goal of this publication is going to be, hopefully released in the next year. And with that, I'm definitely over time. Apologies, but thank you so much for your time.
Cool. Yeah. Just ask questions. I'm gonna just start, getting everything cleaned up because we gotta leave in like 30 minutes.
Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you. The way you present is like a dance.
Yes.
And so